Consider this. It's your wedding day. You're 12 years old. A stranger 3 times your age is about to become your husband. A man chosen by your father. A man you met only days ago. But that's not the worst part. Before dawn, your mother wakes you. Her hands are shaking as she holds something you've never seen before. A spear. Not a ceremonial replica, a real weapon. One that, if the stories are true, has already pierced human flesh and taken a life in battle. She uses its blood-stained point to part your hair strand by strand while whispering the same thing her mother whispered to her on her wedding day. Tonight, do not resist. Within hours, you'll be dragged screaming through the streets of Rome, while a mob chants obscene verses about what's about to happen to your body. You'll be carried over a threshold smeared with wolf fat and in a room filled with incense and shadows in front of a bed placed deliberately in the most public part of the house. A knot will be untied that can never be tied again. This isn't fiction. This isn't the plot of some horror film. This is what actually happened at Roman weddings, not hidden in dungeons or whispered about in shame, but celebrated, ritualized, and performed in broad daylight for over 1,000 years. Stay with me for the next few minutes because when this ritual ends, you'll understand why Rome never needed to hide it. Let's address the elephant in the room first. Ios Primonoctes, the rite of the first night. You've heard this story before. Evil feudal lords, tyrannical kings, the supposed right to bed a vassal's new bride before her own husband could touch her. It's appeared in everything from Braveheart to medieval horror stories, painting a picture of ultimate sexual exploitation hidden behind walls of power. Here's the truth. When it comes to ancient Rome, that specific practice is almost certainly a myth. Modern historians have searched exhaustively for evidence of Ius Primonoctes in the Roman world, and what they've found is nothing. No laws, no credible contemporary accounts, no archaeological evidence. It appears to be a fabrication, likely born from later medieval propaganda and humanity's endless fascination with painting the past as barbaric. So we can breathe a sigh of relief, right? The horror story was just that, a story wrong. Because while that particular nightmare may be fiction, what actually happened to Roman brides was arguably worse. Not worse because it was more violent, though it often was, but worse because it wasn't hidden. It wasn't a corruption of the system, it was the system. It wasn't an abuse of power happening in the shadows, it was power itself, displayed proudly for all of Rome to witness and celebrate. The real horror of a Roman wedding night wasn't that the rules were being broken. It was that everyone was following them perfectly. See, when we imagine ancient abuse, we picture it happening in secret, a crime, something shameful that perpetrators hide. But what happens when the abuse isn't hidden at all? What happens when it's written into law, blessed by priests, cheered on by crowds, and considered not just acceptable, but sacred? What happens when the victim is told that her suffering is duty, that her terror is tradition, that her body is not her own and never was? That's what we're really talking about today. Not a myth, but a documented, systematized, religiously sanctioned ritual that treated women not as human beings with autonomy, but as property to be transferred from one owner to another. And it all started with a weapon. Dawn breaks on a young girl's wedding day in Rome sometime around 100 B.C. Let's call her Lucia, though her name doesn't really matter. This story could be about thousands of girls across centuries of Roman history. Lucia is 13 years old. She's been betrothed since she was a child to a man she's met exactly twice. He's 34, a minor government official with political connections to her father. She knows almost nothing about him except that in a few hours he will have complete legal control over her body, her property, and her very existence. But first, the hasty Cabarrus, the celibate spear. Her mother and the household slaves gather around her in the pre-dawn darkness. There's no gentle brushing, no tender moment between mother and daughter. Instead, her mother produces a spear, the hasta, and begins the ritual that will transform her from daughter to wife. The spear is inserted into Lucia's hair, and its sharp point is used to meticulously part it into 6 sections. Each section is then braided with ritualistic precision, mimicking the hairstyle of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses. The entire process takes over an hour. One slip of the hand, one flinch from Lucia, and that spear point could slice her scalp open. Why a spear? The ancient philosopher Plutarch, writing in the 1st century CE, offers several theories that Romans themselves debated. Some said it honored Mars, the god of war, in hopes that the marriage would produce strong warrior sons. Others claimed it was a gesture toward military victory and the strength of Rome itself. But Plutarch also recorded a darker interpretation, one that cuts closer to the truth. The spear was a deliberate callback to Rome's foundational myth, the rape of the Sabine women. Let me tell you that story because it matters. According to Roman legend, in the city's earliest days, Rome had a serious problem. There weren't enough women. The surrounding tribes refused to let their daughters marry Romans, seeing the new city as nothing more than a haven for criminals and outcasts. So Rome's founder Romulus devised a plan. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a great festival, a celebration of games and religious rites. The Sabines came, men, women, and children, expecting diplomacy and entertainment. Instead, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men attacked. They didn't kill the Sabine men, not yet. Instead, they grabbed the Sabine women and girls, dragging them away by force while their fathers, brothers, and wood-husbands were driven back with swords. The women were distributed among Roman men as wives, not asked, not courted, taken. And according to the myth, these abducted women eventually came to love their captives, even intervening to stop a war between Rome and Sabine when their birth families tried to rescue them. This wasn't a shameful secret in Roman culture. It was a founding myth. It was celebrated in art, referenced in poetry, and yes, reenacted symbolically at every single traditional Roman wedding. The spear wasn't just styling a bride's hair. It was a reminder renewed with every marriage that wives were fundamentally captured, that marriage was in its essence a conquest, that a woman's body was a prize to be claimed by force, sanctified by tradition. And here's what makes this even more chilling. According to some ancient sources, the spear used in the ritual was ideally one that had already killed a man in battle. A weapon literally baptized in human blood was the first thing to touch a bride on her wedding day. Think about the psychological weight of that moment. You're a young girl, and the very first ritual of your wedding, the moment that begins your transformation from maiden to wife, is performed with an instrument of death. What message does that send? What does it tell you about what's coming next? The answer is written in every detail of what followed. To understand why these rituals existed, we need to talk about something deeply unsexy, but absolutely crucial. Roman law. For most of Roman history, particularly in the Republic and early Empire, the most traditional and prestigious form of marriage was called conventio in manum, which translates literally as passage into the hand. Here's how it worked. From birth, a Roman woman existed under someone's pestis, their legal power. If her father was alive, she was under his patria, potestas, his paternal power. This wasn't just symbolic, it was absolute. He controlled whether she could marry, who she could marry, whether she could own property, and whether she could even keep her own children if she became a widow. In the eyes of Roman law, an unmarried daughter was legally similar to a child, regardless of her age. The in manu marriage ceremony existed for one purpose: to transfer that power from father to husband, to literally pass the woman from one man's hand to another's. After the wedding, she was no longer part of her birth family. Not legally, not religiously, not in any sense that mattered under Roman law. She took on the legal status of her husband's daughter. Yes, you read that correctly. In the eyes of the law, her wife was legally equivalent to her husband's child. Any property she might have inherited, now it belonged to her husband. Any legal disputes involving her, her husband handled them. Her entire legal identity was subsumed into his household. Now, I need to be precise here because Roman marriage law evolved significantly over the centuries. By the late Republic, and especially during the Empire, a different form of marriage called sin manu, without the hand, became increasingly common. particularly among the elite classes. In a Senu marriage, a woman could remain under her father's pestis, or if her father was dead and she had no male guardian, she could even gain a degree of legal independence. She could own property, conduct business, and maintain significant autonomy. Some elite Roman women wielded enormous power through senior monu marriages. But, and this is crucial, even as the legal reality changed, the ritual didn't. The ceremonies, the symbolism, the entire theatrical performance of a Roman wedding continued to be based on the older in manum model. Why? Because these rituals weren't really about the law. They were about power, tradition, and social control. A daughter's consent to marriage was technically required under Roman law. But let's be realistic about what consent meant for a girl who'd been raised from birth, knowing that her father had the absolute right to arrange her marriage, that refusal could bring shame on her entire family, and that she had virtually no other options for her future. She would recite the traditional formula ubu gas ego ga, where you are gas I am Gaia. On the surface, it sounds like a beautiful vow of partnership, but its deeper meaning was clear. Wherever you go, I follow. Your identity subsumes mine. Your world becomes my world. I am joining you. You are not joining me. And there was one more physical symbol of this transfer, one more lock that needed a key, the cingulum. This was a woolen belt tied around the bride's waist with an incredibly complex knot called the nodus Herculeus, the knot of Hercules. This wasn't decorative. It was symbolic of her virginity, her protected status. Her body is sealed territory. The knot was deliberately difficult to untie, designed to be a puzzle, a challenge, and there was only one person with the right to untie it. Her husband on their wedding night in what would come next. As the sun began to set, the most theatrical and psychologically brutal part of the Roman wedding began, the Dalum deducture, the procession to the groom's house. This was no quiet, dignified walk. This was orchestrated chaos, a deliberate spectacle of mock violence that reenacted step by step the legendary abduction of the Sabine women. First, the groom approached the bride. In front of both families, in front of witnesses, he grabbed her with a display of force. This wasn't gentle. Ancient sources describe him seizing her, pulling her with visible strength from her mother's arms. The bride, for her part, was expected to play her role. She cried out, she struggled. She appeared to resist. Was it all performance? Roman writers claimed it was ritualistic, that the bride's apparent reluctance was meant to payday the household gods of her birth family to assure them she wasn't leaving willingly and thus wouldn't anger them. But here's the question that should haunt us. When does performance become reality? When does ritual fear turn into actual terror? If you're a 12-year-old girl being grabbed by a man 3 times your age while your mother screams, at what point does your brain stop distinguishing between theater and trauma? The procession that followed was a carnival of intimidation. Torchbearers led the way, not subtle candles but massive flaming torches that turned the Roman streets into a tunnel of flickering shadows. Flute players walked alongside their music high-pitched and otherworldly, and surrounding the bride and groom was a crowd, friends, family, hired brants, random citizens drawn by the spectacle. They sang. Oh, did they sing? These were called Fessine verses, obscene, sexually explicit songs and chants specifically designed to be as LWD and graphic as possible. The official reason to ward off evil spirits with vulgarity. But imagine being that bride being marched through the streets while a mob of people, some strangers, shouts increasingly explicit descriptions of what's about to happen to your body once you reach that house. Ancient sources, particularly the poet Catullus, preserve some of these verses. I can't repeat most of them here, but they left nothing to the imagination. They joked about the wedding night, about deflation, about the bride's pain and the groom's conquest. They laughed about it. This was considered entertainment. The bride was expected to smile through it all, to accept it as part of the celebration. As the procession wound through Rome's streets, other elements were added to the spectacle. Boys carried the bride's spindle and daft tools of weaving, marching ahead of her as symbols of her future domestic servitude. Someone scattered nuts in the crowd, a fertility symbol, but also a way to draw even more people to watch to bear witness to this transfer of ownership. When they finally reached the groom's house, the doorpost would already be decorated, draped with woolen ribbons, and smeared with oils or animal fat. Some sources specifically mention wolf fat, drawing yet another connection to Rome's founding myth. Remember, Romulus and Remus were supposedly raised by a she-wolf. At the threshold, the final act of the abduction took place. The bride was not allowed to walk over the threshold herself. This was crucial. Tripping as you entered your new home was considered an absolutely terrible omen, potentially cursing the entire marriage. So instead, the groom lifted her again, just like carrying captured property, and carried her bodily over the threshold. Today, this is one of the few Roman wedding customs that has survived, and we think of it as romantic. The groom sweeping his bride off her feet, carrying her into their new life together. But the origin has nothing to do with romance. It's about preventing bad omens and more darkly about physically demonstrating that the bride doesn't enter this house on her own terms. She's brought in, she's carried in like plunder, the door shut behind them. The crowd remained outside, but the shouting continued for hours. The Fessin verses growing even crudder as wine flowed and inhibitions dropped. Inside, in the sudden relative quiet of the house, the final rituals were about to begin. The atrium, the central hall of a Roman house, was dimly lit with oil lamps and thick with incense, and there positioned prominently in the semi-public heart of the home was the lectus genialis, the marriage bed. Its placement was not accidental. This wasn't tucked away in a private bedroom. This was furniture placed where visitors, clients, and household members would regularly see it. The marriage bed was a statement, a monument to the family's legitimacy and the wife's primary purpose. The bride was led to this bed by the praenuba, a matron of honor who had been married only once. This was important. She had to be a univira, a woman faithful to a single marriage, representing the ideal the bride was supposed to embody for the rest of her life. At the bed, the husband approached. The room would likely contain a few select witnesses, perhaps close family members, perhaps trusted friends, though exactly who remained and who left at this point varies in historical accounts. What we know for certain is this: the husband untied the knot of Hercules. This action was loaded with symbolism. The knot represented the bride's virginity, her protected status, her body as sealed territory that was now being opened. Hercules himself was a symbol of masculine strength and frankly virility. He was famous in mythology for his sexual conquests, fathering dozens of children. The untying of the knot was not meant to be quick. The complexity of the knot meant the husband had to work at it, had to struggle with it, while the bride stood there waiting. Every second of that struggle was a reminder of what was about to happen, of what she was about to lose. When the knot finally came undone, the bride's tunic loosened. And here we enter the part of the wedding night that history has worked very, very hard to sanitize, to romanticize, to reframe as something other than what it was. Modern historians, particularly Paul Vane, in his groundbreaking work on Roman sexuality, have characterized what happened next with startling directness. Vane describes the expected consummation as taking the form of what he calls a legal rape. Now, that's a modern historian's interpretation using modern terminology, not ancient Roman legal language. But Vane chooses that phrase deliberately, and we need to understand why. The concept of ongoing sexual consent within marriage, the idea that a wife has the right to refuse sex with her husband, that her yes must be enthusiastic and freely given each time, that marital rape is a real and prosecutable crime. This concept did not exist in Roman law. It didn't exist in most legal systems until shockingly recently in human history. In Roman marriage, particularly in the traditional in manum model, a wife's body was not legally her own. Her husband had the right, even the duty to consummate the marriage. Her role was to submit. Her feelings about this submission were legally irrelevant. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't something Romans were ashamed of. It was the point. The wedding night consummation served multiple functions in Roman society. First, it legally confirmed the marriage. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. The physical act was the final seal on the contract. Second, it established the husband's sexual rights over his wife's body, rights that would continue for the duration of the marriage. Third, and perhaps most importantly to Romans, it opened the possibility of legitimate heirs. The entire point of Roman marriage from a legal and social perspective was to produce children, specifically legitimate male children who could inherit property and carry on the family name. The bride's virginity was crucial because it ensured that any child she bore could be unquestionably attributed to her husband. Her value as a bride was directly tied to her unopened status, her lack of sexual history, her body as unmarked territory. And so on that bed in the atrium, surrounded by incense and shadows, that territory was claimed. Ancient sources are deliberately vague about the specific details of consummation, and modern historians debate exactly how much privacy a couple was afforded. Some sources suggest that witnesses might remain in the room but behind a curtain. Others suggest the couple was left completely alone. The truth probably varied by time period, social class, and individual family customs. But here's what we do know. Whether or not anyone was physically watching, the act itself was performed with the full knowledge and expectation of everyone in the house and everyone who had attended the wedding. This wasn't a private moment of intimacy between two people who loved each other. This was a legal requirement, a social obligation, a duty being performed to satisfy family expectations and social norms. For the bride, this first sexual experience would have been many things. It might have been painful. Medical knowledge about female sexuality was primitive, and the idea of ensuring the bride's comfort or pleasure wouldn't have been a priority. It was almost certainly frightening, especially for very young brides who would have had only the vaguest understanding of what sex entailed. But most of all, it was a lesson about her new status, a lesson about her new lack of autonomy, a lesson about what her body was for. And in the morning, there would be proof required. The bloodied sheets from the marriage bed might be displayed or at least examined to confirm the bride's virginity. In some periods and some families, this was done publicly. Her body's most private moment became public evidence. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who doesn't shy away from history's uncomfortable truths. This is exactly the kind of content we create here every single week. The stories that get glossed over, sanitized, or completely erased from popular history books. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started. Now, let's talk about why this story matters today. So here's the question that should be bothering you. If these rituals were performed openly, celebrated publicly, and woven into the very fabric of Roman society, why don't we hear about them more? The answer isn't what you might think. Rome didn't try to erase this history. The change happened gradually over centuries through a combination of cultural evolution, religious transformation, and deliberate historical myth-making. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century CE, these pagan wedding rituals began to shift. The early Christian church had its own complicated relationship with marriage and sexuality. But the overt symbolism of conquest, the spear, the mock abduction, the Fessine verses, these were gradually replaced with Christian ceremonies that emphasized different values at least superficially. But the deeper transformation happened in how later generations chose to remember Rome. From the Renaissance onward, Western civilization developed an almost romantic obsession with classical antiquity. Rome became the model of civilization, of law, of culture. We built our government buildings to look like Roman temples. We studied Latin and Greek. We held up Roman philosophy and engineering as the pinnacle of human achievement. And in that process of glorification, we did what humans always do with uncomfortable history. We softened it. We selected the parts we liked and quietly ignored the parts that made us uncomfortable. We remembered the aqueducts and forgot the spear. We celebrated the Senate and overlooked the systematic legal subjugation of half the population. We marveled at the Colosseum and chose not to think too hard about what the women in the crowd had endured in their own homes. Modern popular culture has perpetuated this sanitized version. Movies and TV shows set in ancient Rome focus on gladiators, emperors, and military campaigns. When they do show Roman marriages, they're often portrayed with modern sensibilities, romantic, consensual, a meeting of equals. Even academic history, until relatively recently, largely overlooked the female experience in Rome. The historians were men writing about men focused on politics and warfare. The public sphere that Roman men dominated the private sphere, the domestic sphere where women's lives unfolded that was considered less important, less worthy of serious scholarship. It's only in the last few decades that historians like Mary Beard, Sarah Pomeroy, Eve Damra, and Paul Vane have really pushed back against this narrative, using archaeological evidence, ancient letters, medical texts, and legal documents to reconstruct what life was actually like for Roman women. And what they've found is deeply uncomfortable. They found that Roman civilization, for all its achievements, was built on a foundation of systematic gender oppression that touched every aspect of a woman's life from the moment she was born to the moment she died. The wedding night rituals we've discussed today weren't aberrations. They weren't the worst parts. They were just the most visible part of a much larger system of control. After her wedding night, a Roman woman's life continued under her husband's authority. He controlled her property, her social interactions, her body. If he wanted to have sex, she had no legal right to refuse. If she committed adultery, he could kill her under certain circumstances. If he committed adultery, which was incredibly common, she had virtually no legal recourse. Her value was measured primarily in her ability to produce legitimate heirs, preferably male. If she was infertile, she could be divorced. If she had only daughters, she might be blamed for failing in her duty. Her body was a vessel for continuing the family line, not a site of her own pleasure or autonomy. So why does this matter today? Because the echoes of these Roman attitudes about women, marriage, and sexuality didn't die with the Roman Empire. They flowed through the centuries, shaping medieval European marriage customs, influencing the development of Western legal systems, and creating cultural narratives about gender roles that we're still fighting against today. The idea that a wife's body belongs to her husband that persisted in Western law for centuries. Marital rape wasn't criminalized in all 50 U.S. states until 1993. Let that sink in. In 1993, less than 35 years ago, the idea that a woman's primary value lies in her virginity before marriage and her fertility within it still shapes cultural attitudes across the globe. The notion that marriage is fundamentally about the transfer of a woman from her father's control to her husband's, still embedded in traditions like fathers giving away brides at weddings. We like to think we've moved beyond all this, and in many ways legally and socially we have. But understanding where these ideas came from, understanding that they weren't just natural or inevitable, but were deliberately constructed and reinforced through rituals like the ones we've discussed today. That's crucial for continuing to dismantle them. The Roman wedding night with its spears and its mock abductions and its legal rapes is a mirror, and what it reflects back at us is uncomfortable. It shows us a society that openly celebrated systems of control that we now recognize as deeply harmful. It reminds us that tradition is often just another word for the way those in power have always maintained their power. But it also shows us something else, that these systems aren't immutable, they can change, they have changed, and they can continue to change. The girl being parted with a spear, being dragged through the streets, being carried over the threshold into a life she had little choice in. She existed. Thousands of girls like her existed across 1,000 years of Roman history. Their experiences were real, their fear was real, their pain was real. And the fact that history tried to forget them, tried to soften their stories, tried to turn their trauma into romance, that's real too. So we remember not to condemn people who lived 2,000 years ago for failing to live up to modern moral standards, but to understand how we got here. To recognize that progress isn't inevitable, to see that the rights and autonomy we have today were fought for, often against systems that claim to be natural, traditional, and sacred. The spear is still there, buried in history, but now at least we can see it for what it always was. Not a hairpin, but a weapon. Not a tradition to celebrate, but a truth to reckon with.